area of the U.S. Let's see. Sorry about that. Arizona represents about 90% of the area of the U.S. Sky Islands, and in Arizona alone, the Sky Islands only take up 3% of the state's area, but there is over half of all plants found, vascular plants found within that Sky Island region. These plants are the really characteristic, iconic ones that we love to go see in the mountains. This is just a small number of plants here that you can see, and there's a lot more of these that we'll be talking about, or that are the point of the study. But these are the plants that people are really excited about seeing. We love all the plants, but these are some of the really interesting and iconic ones. So I was interested in wanting to look at what is the distribution of these subtropical plants. And here's our study area, which is the overall Madrean Archipelago ecoregion. And you can see the top portion of the ecoregion is the US. This is just what we're referring to as a region because basically I'm delineating it based on an arbitrary international boundary. But what's interesting is after running all of this information, not surprisingly, there is a pretty strong ecological gradient that occurs close to the international border here. So even though this is arbitrary, it's useful because this area is how policy is defined in our area with the states for Arizona and New Mexico. Another thing for this area, what contributes to the rich diversity in our area, mountains themselves are very species-rich areas for a lot of reasons. The mountains themselves create and alter circulation, precipitation, temperature. There are areas in the mountains based on the upslope and downslope wind dynamics in mountains that create increased precipitation in some areas, rain shadows in other areas. And overall, our region is kind of defined by a general northwest trending geology. And this northwest trending geology is kind of a corridor, a migratory corridor that brings a lot of species up from the south to the north in the direction towards the White Mountain area. So that is one thing that contributes to it. This is the actual study area here, our region, the Arizona, New Mexico Sky Islands. Basically, we define 24 Sky Islands. I'm not going to go into how we define the Sky Islands. I don't want to spend too much time on this. If anybody has any questions afterwards, please ask me and I'll be more than happy to go over it. Two things I should say is that two of the Sky Islands that we defined, Atascosa consists of 3 different Sky Islands. It consists of the Pajaritos, the Atascosas, and the Tumacacris. And the reason why we're defining it as one, as other authors have, is that there really is not a clear differentiating line between those areas. The same is true in Babakivri, which includes in our study Quinlan, as Deo et al. Also did. And again, there's no clear differentiating line between those ranges. So Babakivri includes Quinlan, and Atascosa includes Tumacacri and Pajarito. And this is basically our range. So this is the big question here, is what is the extent of subtropical influence in each Sky Island flora? This is what is the basis of the various analysis that we conducted. Initially, I was tempted to look at this just from pure species richness or subtropical richness, the total number of subtropical plants in each Sky Island. The problem with that is that doesn't really allow us to look at what factors are driving the subtropical plant occurrence, because larger plants that are, Sky Islands that are much larger areas are going to more likely have more subtropical plants than smaller ones. For instance, Santa Catalina, one of our bigger Sky Islands that has the largest known species richness, is going to likely have more subtropical plants than a smaller range like Babakivri. But if anybody in the room, if somebody would say to you, does that mean that Santa Catalina is more subtropical in nature from a botanical perspective than Babakivri? I think most of us would say no. Baba Kivri would have a lot more what we would think of as subtropical plants. So I basically came up with this metric, which has worked out really well. It's a little clunky, but it's called the proportion of subtropical richness. And what this is looking at is it's basically defined as the ratio of subtropical richness, or the total number of subtropical plants in each sky island, the ratio in relation to the total known flora. So what percentage of that flora is subtropical? That's kind of what we're really looking at here, is to really give an idea so that really big species-rich ranges wouldn't outshadow the smaller ranges that would have pretty significant amounts of subtropical plant influences on them. Yay, thank you. And so, sorry about this, the methods do not seem to be coming out that well. So here's, these are some of our methods. The first thing is, how are we defining subtropical plants? And again, this is our definition for subtropical plants, is basically two things. The main thing is plants that have a southern range, plants that originate in Mexico or further south, and find their northern extent in the Sky Islands, the US Sky Islands. Those are generally called peripheral plants, peripheral species, or plants found at the periphery of their range. The second group that seemed logical to include this in as well is that biogeography, plants don't always follow clean distribution. So we also looked at plants that had southern origins, but that mainly stopped in the Catalinas, but had a small number of ephemeral populations north of there. So we wanted to look at those as well, because there are some really interesting plants that have a disjunct occurrence just a little bit north, or a bit north of the Sky Islands. So that was one thing we looked at. And then we needed to review specimens. So thank goodness for SciNet. We all love SciNet. We use SciNet online database and reviewed over 82,000 Sky Island collections. There's never a complete data set for anything that's done. Waiting for a complete data set, you have to just keep waiting and waiting. Luckily, in this case, we have 140 years of collection history and 82,000 records. So for a little bit of slop, statistically, we can come out pretty well with the results and get a good idea. Questionable records were discarded from the data set unless they were made by a reputable collector. And I don't mean to denigrate collectors that I'm not aware of, but just when you're going through such a large volume of specimens, it's really important to try to weed out some of the ones that don't seem to be accurate. And again, with such a large number of samples to go through with the database, that worked out pretty well. As I went through all of these different collections for the Sky Islands, it became clear that one range that seemed particularly important because of some of the really rich areas that had subtropical influences around it was Sierrita, the Sierrita Mountains. And there was only about 100 herbarium collections from the Sierritas. And it seemed at the time a little late, but it seemed that it would be a really good idea to go and try to collect as much in the Sierritas as possible to better understand the subtropical influences in that range, because the Baba Kivris on one side and the Santa Ritas on the other side, and the Atascosas and Tumacacris to the south, it was positioned in the perfect location in a warmer area. So went in there and conducted 9 very fun field days across the whole range. It would be really easy to just go look for nothing but subtropical plants. And I have to tell you, when I found the subtropical plants, it was extremely exciting to find those particular plants. But in order to not create sampling bias, basically I created a checklist for the Sierritas to start with, and then collected everything that was not collected. So I made about 400 collections over those 9 days. To not bias it. And that turned out to be a really good idea, because it really rounded out, and it turned out to be a very important range to look at. So that's what we did there. And then only 8 of the floras of the 28 Sky Islands had either published floras or floras that are nearly complete that are being worked on at this time. So that left us with 16 sky islands that did not have any known inventory. So that brought up the need to have to go through and generate total flora counts for those 16 sky islands. So that was a little bit of extra work as well. This is what we're looking at for, these are some of the variables that we looked at to determine what are the drivers of regional sky island subtropical influences. And a lot of these are what you would expect. So we looked at latitude and longitude, two very important things. Latitude, we know species richness is much greater as latitude gets closer to the tropics. And as you go further away from the tropics, the richness drops. So that would be an obvious one. We also looked at longitude. We looked at area, the logarithm of the total area or the size, the number of hectares or acreage for each sky island. All of this, a lot of this data was conducted in a GIS with spatial analysis or zonal statistics. Then we also looked at elevational gradient. And what we're meaning by that is the difference between the minimum elevation and the maximum elevation of the range. Past studies have shown, and it's pretty logical to conclude that ranges that have greater elevation variance are going to support much richer species numbers because they're going to have more different habitat type, different types of microhabitats. There was a study that Bowers and McLaughlin did in the early 80s where they looked at what are the drivers of species richness in Arizona floras. And that happened to be the most significant driver they found in their study. When I look at their results, I have to think that they had 40 years less of data, and they were also looking at a handful of sky islands with just ranges throughout Arizona that happened to have floras on them. So there were probably a lot of variables. But we looked at that as well. On the left of this graph, you can see that we also looked at geological richness. Originally, I wanted to be able to calculate geodiversity for each of the sky islands. And geodiversity has been known to correlate strongly with species richness and biodiversity as well. What georichnness is it's geological richness along with soil diversity, the number of different soil types, which support different types of plants, along with what are called morphostructures. And morphostructures can be referred to as different types of structural units. You could think of a canyon, a ridge top, a basin as a morphostructure. If you think about in the Santa Catalina Mountains, Molino Basin, that's a great place to drive to. There's huge species diversity in Molino Basin, or at least used to be. There's not quite a bit of disturbance these days, but it's in that basin. So these types of structures really drive diversity. So I wanted to look at geodiversity. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible. We utilized fabulous USGS sources that had soil indexes and geological sources, and those are wonderful, and there's no criticism of those. It's all about funding. Unfortunately, I believe there was 5 major sky islands that had 0 soil data. Including the 2 biggest ones. The Santa Catalina is the 2 richest. The Santa Catalina and Chiricahua had almost no soil. So unfortunately, because there was no soil data available, we were not able to do geodiversity. But it gave us an interesting opportunity because there's almost no studies that have looked at just pure geological richness in relation to an aspect of species richness. So that was an interesting opportunity. How we define geological richness in this is it was done similar to how it's done in geodiversity. Basically the lithology, or how many different types of geological substrates are in each range. The stratigraphy, we looked at chronostratigraphy, so how many different types of geological eras were at play in each range, the mineral richness, how many different types of mineral resources. And a variety of resources were used for this in a GIS. And then additionally, I also did kind of an exhaustive geological literature review and added a lot of additional information. So we got quite a bit on the geological richness. The climate variables are known to be the greatest driver of species richness. So we looked at 2 aspects of precipitation total annual precipitation and monsoon precipitation to see if seasonal precipitation would be more significant than the total. Trying to narrow it down to one temperature, the most significant, minimum winter temperatures. How cold does it get in the winter, which is well known to be a limiting factor with subtropical plants. I should say that all the climate data was generated at a very coarse scale using PRISM model climate data. Originally, I wanted to do this where I wanted to look at a real specific area, about 4,000 feet to 5,500 feet, and basically just analyze those areas in each sky island. But when I did that, the climate data was wildly inaccurate. So what I did was I basically came up with a single number for each of these climate figures, very coarse scale, a single number for each sky island using zonal statistics in a GIS. Oops. Oh dear. Sorry about this. It was working before I got here. Okay, so this page was going to be brutal to begin with for a lot of people, but this is the statistical analyses. And yeah, that's a bummer. It's not working. So my co-author, Kenneth, he performed Bayesian statistical analyses, which were more appropriate for what we were looking at because we had a very small number of samples. Only 24 sky islands required a much more robust technique. So he used Bayesian information criteria to select the variables, which is BIC, which is much more parsimonious than ACA criterion information criteria, which is more commonly used. He generated 20,000 bootstrap samples, sample coefficients, and selected the 5th and 95th percentiles for each coefficient. So that first part was basically what analysis was done to determine the abiotic drivers of what the proportion of how subtropical the area and the region was. The second analysis that was done was to quantify spatial patterns of sky island subtropical beta diversity, or what's known as species turnover, which is also kind of basically species similarity. So by finding out how many species, what species communities occur in each sky island and how they're similar or different than the other sky islands and how they form into clusters of similarity or differences, that tells us about beta diversity or species turnover, which is an aspect of biodiversity. So for this, the main thing that was used was the Bray-Curtis Similarity Index is what was used to come up with that. And then a non-metric multi-dimensional scaling was used, and he also employed a permutation-based clustering algorithm. A similarity profile test was used as well. Again, sorry that all this is blurred up. The last thing that we did statistically was to determine what are the abiotic drivers of the subtropical species similarity. So are they the same drivers as subtropical influences in the area, or are the community composition of these subtropical species within each sky island, are they driven by different things? So, and here's what we ended up with. Here's the results. So we came up with 285 subtropical plants in the Sky Islands, which is rather remarkable when you think about it. That represents about 13.5% of the total species richness within the Sky Islands. So a significant amount of subtropical plants. 2/3 of these, almost exactly 2/3, are plants that are peripheral plants that stop in the Sky Islands, finding their northern extent there, while 1/3 of these plants were the ephemeral peripheral taxa, ones that mostly stopped in the Sky Islands, but were just found in a handful of populations just to the north or the northeast. And how that broke down is the 6 Sky Islands. The figure here basically shows a heat map of the various Sky Islands, with red being more species rich, and the colors going down. You can see the index on the top that tells you what the percentages are. So the six biggest ones that had the highest regional amount of subtropical influence, I was just a little surprised because going into this, like a lot of us, I would have expected that Sycamore Canyon, the Pajaritos, the Atascosa Highlands would be the most subtropical area. But it was interesting to see that the Patagonia had nearly almost a quarter of the entire flora is subtropical. And that's number 12 that we see down here. And what's interesting is all 6 of these ranges are in a kind of a dense cluster on the southwest corner, close to the international border. Nothing is surprising about this, or really most of our results. It's what you would expect, but it's interesting to look at. The Atascosas were the second highest with 19%. The Mule Mountains was interesting, significantly to the east, 16.5% of proportion of subtropical richness, followed closely by the Santa Ritas, 16.4, and then the Babakivris and the Huachuca Mountains had 16%. After that, that was pretty much, at that point was where we saw a relatively significant breakaway point of the subtropical richness started to drop at that point. And from there, we can see Sierrita was the next range that had the 7th highest subtropical richness, is about 13.5%. And then after that, it was Rincon, had 12%. Ranges you would expect, and all within that cluster. So again, it was very useful going into the Sierritas. And what's interesting to look at is before I did the field work in the Sierritas to add those extra 400 collections and really flesh that out better, I believe that the proportion of subtropical richness prior to doing that was about 10.5%. So I thought it was interesting that even with a smaller sample size for the known flora, that the proportion of that seemed to be a really useful metric to describe what was going on with this. And Rincon is really where it kind of tailed off. And that's really what we see when we go out hiking to a certain degree. But you can see that Chiricahua had a pretty good, I think Chiricahua is about 10%. The Whetstones and the Dragoons were rather significant. And then you can see basically what we have here is as it goes to the east, things start to drop off. And as we go to the northeast, things really drop off. And when you look at the Catalinas, which are number 5, Santa Catalina has 9.5%. So what was interesting is that it had, like I was saying at the beginning of the talk, Santa Catalina has about 125 or 124 subtropical plants in its flora, but it has a massive flora. The Babakivris, I believe, only had 99 subtropical plants. So there was way more in Santa Catalina, but Babakivri has a much higher percentage of tropical species. It's 16% versus 9.5%. So that seems like validation for using this metric of the proportion of subtropical richness. So this was kind of the point of the study, was just to be able to look at exactly what's going on with the range. One thing I will say is that we did find there were several ranges that were severely undercollected. And some of these ranges, I tried going to Winchester, and the access to Winchester is really rough. Most of it's private around. There's like one brutal place to get in from the north. And I was kind of turned away on the east side, unable to get in past private land. Winchester is severely undercollected. Big Hatchet was also severely undercollected. And Little Dragoon was relatively undercollected as well. So I included specimens from the nearby Texas Canyon, but was specific that it was Texas Canyon along I-10, not the Texas Canyon occurring in the Chiricahuas. But this is what we're looking at for that. Here's the abiotic drivers. And what we found is at the top of the list is the most significant. Minimum winter temperature was the most significant. Very strong significance, followed by monsoon precipitation. You can see on the list that total annual precipitation was not a significant driver. So this was an interesting result, that seasonal precipitation is a very strong force in subtropical plants. Area was the 3rd most significant driver. Geological richness, I was rather pleased to see that geological richness did play a strong role, even though in some of the statistical analysis, there was a few things that made it a little more suspect. that wasn't quite as strong, even though overall the significance is strong. Latitude was the 5th most significant, and elevational gradient was the 6th most significant. And then we had 3 things that were not statistically significant. And again, this completely varies with what Bowers and McLaughlin found of their sky island flora, but they did great work. That doesn't in any way go to discredit what they did. I think it's just a reflection of 40 years of additional collection and a lot more records that we had the ability to look at. The change in odds ratio is interesting to look at. What that means is when you experience an increase in a single standard deviation, we'll talk about minimum winter temperature. When you increase a single standard deviation of minimum winter temperature, it means that there is a 31.1% chance of any species being subtropical. So you would find the same thing. When you increase monsoon precipitation by 1 standard deviation of our coefficient, then there's a 26.7% increased chance that any species will be subtropical. So that kind of quantifies for you how significant these numbers are. So this was interesting to see. This is for an interesting dendrogram for anybody that loves phylogenetic trees and sky islands. Basically, this shows all of the sky islands and what their subtropical similarity was. How similar were the composition of subtropical species within each flora? And you can see on these trees where there's 2 branches on the tree for some of these, like for instance, we have Huachuca and Chiricahua. And if you look to the left, they are really similar. So the subtropical species composition is about 76% similar in Huachuca and Chiricahua. That's kind of what you're looking at this chart. The higher up the trees go, the less similar they are. And the percentage of similarity is on the left. The solid lines are represented by not a statistical or a statistical difference from related branches of the tree, where the dashed lines represent not a statistical difference. So for instance, Huachuca and Chiricahua, there is not a statistical difference between the species composition of subtropical plants in those ranges. So this gives us an idea of just looking at the dendrogram. And then this is the 2-dimensional representation of the matrix that was come up, that non-parametric 2-dimensional analysis that was done. And so what this is as you start in the bottom left corner and you go up to the top right, you can see how things are. This just goes to show how close things are clustered. And to put in perspective, this is kind of what it means. Is this second one I have highlighted, we have 3 distinct clusters. Is the tightest cluster occurs, this is the first in the main cluster, which includes the plants with the greatest amount of subtropical influences. And here we have 7 sky islands in the main cluster that are really closely together. And then there's 5 or 4 additional sky islands that are a little bit less clustered, but that's the main cluster. And then we have a second cluster that occurs kind of in the middle. And then there's a weaker and a looser cluster that occurs on the outside. You can see 2 sky islands. Number 4 is Winchester. Number 24 on the outside that don't belong to a cluster. Those are both sky islands that were not statistically similar or clustered with any of the others. And the reason being for that appears to be pretty strongly is that the collections were so depauperate in both of those ranges. So there weren't enough collections, unfortunately, in those ranges. And so they're just kind of outliers that didn't work out. This figure shows you, and I apologize, this is not the one I meant to put in here. So there's one thing that's off in here, but this figure is a nice figure that shows you what the previous 2 figures look like on a map. And here you can see the main cluster, Sky Island cluster, is on the left, cluster A. That's the main cluster with the greatest similarity. And then we have the second cluster that is the next tightest, which kind of wraps around. And what's interesting in the first cluster is Chiricahua is the only range that's part of the first cluster, even though it's significantly outside of that cluster to the east. And you could look at several reasons why that might be. Is the Chiricahuas have the third highest monsoon precipitation of the Sky Islands and the fourth highest of the total annual precipitation for the Sky Islands, as well as the largest area, a close proximity to the international border. Anybody's been in the Chiricahuas, they are a rich range. And what's interesting too is the Chiricahuas are kind of the epicenter, have the largest number of endemic US Sky Island plants, as well as the largest number of endemic moth species. So the Chiricahuas are a very rich place, but it's interesting, they show up in the main cluster. And then that second cluster wraps around. And then you can see the weaker cluster is that light blue cluster that's at the extreme east side and northeast side of the range. So here what we see is we see three distinct clusters and a strong longitudinal trend driving this Sky Island subtropical community similarity, and from west to east. And it really would appear pretty strongly that the Sonoran Desert influences on the west side are what are driving this real strong richness. And then the cold temperatures on the east side, the Chihuahuan Desert on the east. And as you go further to the north, one thing I should say too is that statistically we found that the chances of subtropical plants occurring decreased as latitude increased and elevational gradient increased as well, which is exactly what's well known from the literature. As you go up in elevation, species richness goes down. As you go away from the equator and latitude increases, species richness decreases as well. And this is an interesting map that kind of shows a bit more of what's going on with one of the statistical analysis, the link tree that was done. And the lines on the map on the top, the red lines are longitude. The thicker lines represent stronger statistical correlations, and the thinner they are is less statistical. So here you can see on the extreme western side a strong statistical relationship with longitude, which definitely is being, you would assume, is being driven by nearby Sonoran Desert macroclimate. And again, we see strong statistical longitude on the east side, which very cold temperatures were at play over there. And the purple lines represent latitude. And again, you see stronger, real strong breakaway points as you go further into the north. And where the Rincons, Reddington Pass that separates Santa Catalina from Rincon is a strong latitude break that kind of occurs between those two ranges. Kind of highlighting again how subtropical the Rincons are, which is very well known. And in the bottom right corner of this slide, you can also see what the drivers of the community similarity were. Longitude is the biggest driver. So very different than the others, where climate was the main, basically subtropical plants are primarily a function of climate in the Sky Islands, not a surprise. And the community similarity or composition or beta diversity, species turnover, the primary driver is longitude, then with latitude, thirdly with minimum winter temperature, and fourthly by area. What was interesting is when Kenneth removed the two weakest of the samples, Winchester and Big Hatchet, a fifth driver occurred, which was total annual precipitation. So we did look at that as well. And this is, what does this kind of mean? What is the significance of doing all of this? Is understanding the abiotic drivers, what drives and occurs, what causes these subtropical plants to occur, does provide valuable insight into how some of these species may react as our climate continues to worsen and gets more extreme. So that does provide some information as to how some of these plants may react to that. The other thing is it provides some information, some valuable information about conservation significance. And what we also wanted to look at is find out where are the densities. So how we define subtropical hotspots is we basically used the areas, the sky islands with the greatest subtropical richness, or the proportion of greatest subtropical richness. And what we did is we defined hotspots as either individual sky islands, or we defined them as a cluster if they shared biotic similarity from the Bray-Curtis analysis. Statistical analysis was done. So what we came up with is, out of the 6 sky islands, we came up with 4 hotspots. One hotspot was a cluster of 3 sky islands, which is the main hotspot and the epicenter of subtropical plant influences, which is exactly where you'd expect, right in Santa Cruz County. And that is the Santa Ritas, the Atascosa, and Patagonia. They all share biotic similarity. Babakivri was not on the same branch of the tree, so that's its own. Huachuca was different as well, and Mule, which is in a different cluster, was also different. And what we then did is I wanted to take a look at what the average proportion of subtropical richness was for each of the clusters, or each of the hotspots. So you can see the one cluster hotspot had an average of 19.7 proportion of subtropical richness, extremely rich. And what's interesting about this too is, even though Santa Cruz County arbitrarily kind of politically cuts the political boundary, cuts off the northern half of the Santa Ritas, it's interesting to know that all of the subtropical plants occurring in the Santa Ritas all occur within Santa Cruz County. Some of them do bleed off into Pima County as well, but all of the subtropical richness within this hotspot occur within Santa Cruz County. So the greater takeaway is that Santa Cruz County is the epicenter for richness and provides an interesting area of high conservation significance. The purple triangle, I also decided to look at Sue Carnahan's Solero Ranch flora. Fantastic work, very well done and exhaustive. I looked at her whole flora and applied how we define subtropical plants, and the proportion of subtropical richness in her flora at the ranch outside of her house is 16.7%, which is greater than the Huachucas, than the Mule Mountains, than the Babakivris. It's rather shocking, but then again, it's not, because it's in Santa Cruz County, located right in between the Santa Ritas. Even though we didn't look at species richness for this, I have to say that of all the sky islands, the greatest species richness was in the Santa Ritas, which I think is remarkable. After that, it was in Atascosa, and then after that, it was Chiricahua because of its size, Rincon, and Catalina. And another aspect of this too is looking at the ecological corridors and what is contributing to these hotspots, and looking at drainages as corridors. The whole Sky Island region and mountains in general are known as ecological barriers for obvious reasons, a physical barrier that stops things. And Sky Islands being simply defined as mountain ranges that are isolated or separated from similar mountain ranges by broad lowland areas with different vegetation. Those lowland areas can also provide barriers as well sometimes, but the Sky Islands also provide, mountains also act as corridors at times. But in this case, I wanted to highlight on this figure how the drainages, the Santa Cruz River, the San Pedro, various drainages act as ecological corridors that can assist in moving some of these plants and dispersing them. And if you look in the primary hotspot, the #1 in Santa Cruz County and coming up into Pima, we have the San Pedro River that acts as a significant one. And then this is kind of the big conservation takeaway, is in addition, what I did is for each of the hotspots, I looked at what was the subtropical species richness, what was the total number of plants that occurred in that area, what was the percentage, and then looked at rare taxa to have some significance for what we were doing. The rare taxa were defined using NatureServe primarily. We looked at rare, very rare, and vulnerable taxa. And you can see what we came up with here is the Santa Cruz County hotspot, the main hotspot, falling mostly in Santa Cruz County, has 86, almost 87% of all subtropical species in the Sky Islands, U.S. Sky Islands, are found there. Remarkable. And 77% of all of the subtropical rare taxa are found in that area. So that really represents an ideal place for some type of conservation action that could be taken in that area, Skylands in Santa Cruz County, which is particularly relevant considering that right now there are 3 open pit mines proposed in Patagonia, the Skyland with the highest amount of subtropical. And now we have, what are we looking at? 5 or 6 open pit mines that are now proposed in Santa Rita, which has the greatest subtropical richness in the U.S. Sky Islands. And you can see for the other hotspots, interestingly enough, Huachuca had almost over half of the richness and 43% of the rarity. The other 2, Babakiveri and the Mule Mountains, didn't have as high a level of rareness. But that was another question: is are these subtropical hotspots, are they acting as reservoirs of rare taxa? And it makes a lot of sense. It's not surprising at all, because when you're talking about plants that are at the extreme edge of their range, it's highly likely they're going to be rare. So that is one of the takeaways from this study. And that's kind of it there. So we're just kind of ending with some more plants and some subtropical areas. So I really appreciate the opportunity to present this to everybody. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at this time.
Yeah, you mentioned unreliable or questionable records. How did you define questionable records?
That's a great question. So questionable records are basically records that were completely disjunct specimens. So if it hadn't even been seen in the state, if it wasn't known from like a long ways away, records that were collected from out-of-state herbarium, if they were not reputable or known collectors. Out-of-state herbarium, I mean, it's common for all of us when we travel to a different state. We know the plants in our area. Many of us think, oh, that looks like this. We often know a genus, we'll identify it, bring it back, and you can just look at a lot of records that are from out-of-state herbarium that aren't always that accurate. So when you're looking at that many records, we just had to try to eliminate the really wild stuff. And things that were known to be extirpated from the ranges were things we also excluded too. But that was kind of the main thing, is that you'd look at a record and nobody had collected it anywhere nearby. It was known from extreme northeastern Arizona, and it's a collector that I hadn't heard of, not that I'm familiar with every collector, but that you don't see very often, but didn't have very many collectors that came and collected something that seemed completely out of place. That no other collectors had found that had been working in specific ranges. So things like that just really kind of tipped off a red flag.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you.
But yeah, no, good question. So any other questions? Or yes.
Well, I found it really interesting that your minimum temperature was such an important driver of your species richness there.
Yeah. And I wanted to originally look at a lot of different variables, but unfortunately with a statistical analysis, you have to limit it. If you add too many variables, you get too much noise and you can't get good results. So I really started looking, I did some preliminary just looking at spatially in a GIS of different types of temperature data. And that one seemed like the most logical, and that's also well known that freezing temperatures limit.
And if you look at your hot spots and you look at your highest proportion of subtropical plants, those are the very areas where we're getting the appearance of overwintering subtropical bird species coming in, as well as insects, as well as invasive grasses. I mean, it looks like they're all converging here.
Absolutely.
And the data looks like it's coming together for different species as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even though we just looked at vascular plants, like you're saying, they really seem to serve as an indicator for all of the species. We're not really looking at the biodiversity, but those are the ranges where you find this stuff.
Right.
And it's really interesting. They're all congregated, aggregated, the southwest portion of the range, closer in proximity to that warmer Sonoran Desert macroclimate, and closer to the international border. So you see this really strong, what I was talking about earlier, ecological gradient that occurs close to that border. Borders are purely arbitrary political boundaries. But in this case, as we know, it's kind of disappointing that we have this and now this giant wall creating all these problems, ecological problems there, and right along an area that is ecologically very significant. And the overall Madrean archipelago ecoregion, it's massive and it's so different in climate that I would imagine it would probably be pretty logical to break that into 3 different areas. And you could look at maybe the northern section, that's maybe a moderate subtropical area where our hotspots occur, down a little more into northern Sonora and perhaps the southern area. I'm not experienced in the Mexican Sky Islands, but it is interesting to see that there is a very strong ecological gradient occurring really close to the border.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, sometimes when I'm looking at various species of arthropods, I've noticed that sometimes I'll pop up with things that I'll find things in my yard here in Vail, Arizona, that is similar to things that have only been found in the very southern tip of Texas. So kind of relating to what you were just talking about, that international borders aren't necessarily where animals stop being seen. But I've kind of wondered whether there's contiguous habitat if you were to include below the border and all the way to Texas possibly for some of this stuff. Has anyone looked at like extending beyond the border, but also much further east? Because that southern tip of Texas seems to be kind of another weird little area that I get a lot of overlap with for at least arthropods.
That's a great question and a great observation. And as I was looking at a lot of the range distributions for these species, of course, a lot of these plants were coming into the tip of Texas, and it's very subtropical down there. And so there is a distinct connection between those. I originally wanted to look at all of the Sky Islands. The reason why I did not was because, and I would love to see that study, what you're talking about. The reason why I kept it purely in the United States is because I was not able to get any geological information. I wasn't able to get a lot of the data, the climate information that I needed in order to run the spatial analysis in a GIS and actually generate the data set to get the abiotic drivers. But that was the first thing I wanted to do. As I was starting to look at this, I wanted to look at the ecoregion. But what ended up happening is because of the availability of data and the lack of availability of data from the Mexican Sky Islands, at least to somebody like me that doesn't speak Spanish, that isn't familiar with what resources are available, and they certainly wouldn't be available for me to read in any kind of easy fashion. I basically had to switch to just looking at a region rather than an ecoregion. But yeah, you're really talking about a more significant ecological connection between states, from an ecological perspective, as opposed to just a political area. So that was kind of the reason why this study was limited, is I was disappointed that I couldn't find any geology information about the Mexican Sky Islands. I'm sure there's something out there, I'd like to think, but there wasn't the USGS information. All the PRISM data stops at the international border. So I wasn't able to get that. And the PRISM data turned out to be a pretty useful source, especially when you look at it on a really coarse, big scale. Small scale, you can have a lot of inaccuracies, but on a big scale, it really was interesting. It worked out pretty good. So yeah, that's a great question and observation. And where you're at in Vail, right near the southern tip of the Rincons, that's even though you're cold, there's a lot of subtropical plants in there. And when a lot of us think of subtropical, we think of warm. And we talked about the minimum winter temperatures, but these subtropical plants that we were looking at, Plants reaching the northern range here, there's a range. Subtropical species have a different range of cold tolerance. So as we go up higher in the mountains, you will find some subtropical plants at the edge of their range that have higher cold tolerances and aren't going to be growing in a desert. But great question. Yes.
How much rainfall would it take to give an area a true subtropical climate designation?
That's a good question. I tend to think I tend to think my memory off the top of my head is somewhere of about 42 inches, 40 inches, so significantly beyond where we're at. Yeah, we don't even qualify, not even in the really rich areas. But I want to say, my memory may be inaccurate, but I want to say Hawthorne and Tree did a great book on climate where they defined all of the regions, different areas, and they defined different types of subtropical regions. And what our region really falls in the category of is humid subtropical region, because subtropical, there's the Mediterranean subtropical, the dry subtropical region, and ours is really the humid subtropical region, which is driven by, that's what's so interesting about our Sky Island area, is that it's influenced by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The North American monsoon is the big one. And so that monsoon, that warm, humid monsoon. But I think about 40 inches or more, I believe.
We have a question in the chat. Is this research available to read? I'd like to study it some more.
We are going to submit it and hope to get it published. So hopefully it'll be available maybe in about a year or so. Yeah, we're pretty close. I'm just kind of finishing up the last editing and stuff. And so hopefully it'll be published in about a year or so.
We have a comment. This is great stuff. Did you know that Coronado National Forest recently hired a botanist? It's been over 20 years since this forest, the most biodiverse in the US in terms of plants, I think, had a botanist. I hope he or she will be in touch with you about this.
Yeah, two great things. Yeah, that was wonderful to see that they hired a botanist. I know it's been about, geez, I don't know if it's been 10 years or so since they've had one. And you know, the Coronado, in their defense, is it's really disappointing how limited of a budget all these different agencies get. Everybody, Coronado and all the national forests could use a massive budget. If they had more money, they could do a lot. I mean, they're still legally required to have to offer, you know, for multiple resource use. So that is always going to be a mandate for them. But with a lot more money, they could do so much more, so much better work. And it's disappointing that they don't have the funding. So hopefully they can get a little more funding and be able to maintain. I know the botanist position, I believe, was for 1 year position with the possibility to be extended for several more years. And that might be all that they can afford with their budget. And when you think about how much they're spending on fire, having to control fires and fire retardants, it is just insane the amount of money that they have to spend on this now. And I really doubt that Congress is allocating more money for that. When you look at how devastating these fires are and how desperately they need, even the amount of fire retardant being spent. I remember on the smaller Catalina fire that happened about 4 years ago, not the Bighorn fire, but the Burrow fire, that was only a 27,000 acre fire, and they had to use, I believe it was something like 235,000 gallons of fire retardant, and that's about $65 or more a gallon. That's a lot of money. So this, how much was the Bighorn fire? Did they use like millions of gallons? 3 million. Wow. 43 million. Oh my goodness, that is astonishing. Wow, thank you for sharing that. That is really interesting. So you think of the budget, that's probably their whole budget for, I mean, I would imagine it's so yeah, I'd love to hear from the botanist and wish them all the best.
We have a comment and then a question. Would be interested in knowing if the wall is affecting plant diversity in Santa Cruz County, followed by a question. Would you expect similar variation looking at plants in higher and colder areas east and southeast of us in Mexico and the US?
I would tend to think that the drivers here would probably be similar drivers down there. And the other thing that there was a lot of information that was not covered tonight because there was a lot that we did in the paper. So a lot that I wasn't able to cover. But what was interesting that I didn't mention is that what we found with the drivers is that the drivers that we found in our analysis were relatively consistent with general drivers of species richness. And we didn't look at species richness, we looked at the proportion of species richness, but there was no comparable studies that looked at the proportion of species richness because this was kind of a unique metric. And you can see it was a good metric that worked out really well for what we were looking at, but it's a little bit of apples and oranges to compare, but at the same time, that was the only comparison that we could make. And the drivers were pretty consistent of what we found is that temperature was the most significant driver of species richness, and temperature and precipitation, climate is the most significant drivers, and then latitude, species richness, area, a lot of these things were correlated similar. So I would expect to find the similar drivers that a higher, and what was interesting too is we looked at the elevational gradient. So not just the high elevation, but what was the variation in elevation in each range. And as that variation got really big, the subtropicals went down. Not just, so that's a little bit different than the highest. We didn't just look at maximum elevation. We looked at the difference between minimum and maximum. But as that gradient got bigger, the richness went down. So I would tend to think that, yeah, as you go further south, and then you'd also have to, it'd probably be the same thing, is that as you got ranges, as you got mountain ranges that were closer to the east, perhaps. And again, my knowledge of biogeography in Mexico is not great, so I don't want to go out on a limb with this. But I would imagine that, yeah, that's one thing you'd really have to look at is the geographical relationship to warmer and colder nearby macroclimates would be the same thing.
And then we have a couple of comments, but I want to skip to a question here. Massimo asks, are annual species a big part of the overall number of subtropical plants?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, and I didn't mention that in the talk, but most of the subtropical plants were perennials. Which is kind of a reflection of the overall flora in general. I think it was something like, I should have looked at this before I came, but I wasn't planning on saying this. I did break apart the life forms and annual, perennial. And I think it was about something like about 2/3 of the subtropical plants were perennials, and maybe about 1/3 of them were annuals. So yeah, that is a significant portion were annuals. And some really cool ones are annuals, you know, Kufia wrightii, Crusea wrightii, Jackmontia agrestis. I mean, geez, some of the really great ones are annuals.
Cool, that's
I'd love to hear some representation for annuals, because there's, you know, it's nice when we like all of the plant forms, the perennials and the annuals, because annuals are very ecologically important. And I know that some of us prefer the perennials, but they're all good. So great question.
I have one more thought anyway. I wanted to throw out there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Well, you know, one thought I have is that some areas that seem in the world anyway, that seem to have incredibly high diversity of species overall, seems to be areas that have been the least bit changed over geological time. In other words, like if you look at, say, the southern tip of like South Africa has this huge diversity of Ericaceae. The Amazon has this huge diversity. If you look at the Smoky Mountains, those are really old mountains, and they have this enormous diversity of species of everything from, you know, freshwater mussels to plants to fungi. And it occurred to me that maybe some of the diversity, it just is, the time is a factor in allowing things to evolve. So has anyone factored in that with, you know, like areas as you go further south, maybe the Pleistocene had less of a effect on those areas?
That's a really that's a great point to make. As you were saying that, I started thinking about all of the geological changes that have occurred in our Sky Island region over the past 80 million years, and which is, I mean, seemingly recent if you look at it from a geological perspective. So the areas you were talking about that were extremely rich seem very different than our Sky Island region that's gone through massive amounts of geological change. So I don't really know if anybody's looked at that, but yeah. So what do you think about considering that what you said in relation to the Sky Islands have experienced a lot of change from a geological perspective over the past 80 million years?
It would just be really interesting to compare some areas that have, look at the amount of diversity that's been documented and look at how much change has occurred in those from a, geological or climate perspective in terms of, if they were covered by ice sheets or not and that sort of thing. Areas that basically were left alone long enough to allow things to evolve to their utmost kind of. To me, South Africa is a good example. The Ericaceae, they've probably evolved to the nth degree that they're going to evolve. I mean, you're talking about like 800 species of Ericaceae or something like that in South Africa. So I'm just thinking that time as a factor and lack of catastrophic changes in climate, being a factor in species diversity. It's just something that kind of throwing out there.
Now that's a really great point you bring up, and I would tend to think that you'd need to find areas that had similar latitudes. If you were going to try to compare those, that might be challenging. But I wonder, and similar orientations on the climate, perhaps. So you could find kind of similar climactic to be able to make a better comparison with it, possibly. But yeah, great comment. That's really interesting.
Got a question.
Yes.
So how or if has this work influenced and changed your work at Desert Survivors in terms of like which plants you grow, how you grow them, ex situ conservation of some of these species, kind of weird, funky, cool ones that we love?
I don't think it's changed how we grow plants. I will say it's changed how I look at all the plants, because anytime it's one of these subtropical plants, I get really excited about it. And I think, oh, I'm excited about this plant, but I don't know if anybody else is. And I'm like, oh, that's a subtropical plant. And I get really excited now. So that's probably changed my enthusiasm for growing some of the subtropical ones. And, since you bring that up with growing plants, these subtropical plants and our region in general, we're kind of a regional ecotone where we shift from one ecoregion to another ecoregion, and those areas have been proposed as areas of as like indicator areas for environmental change, because those areas are really sensitive to change and climatic change. So these subtropical plants, that was one thing that I thought about, is how are these plants going to be affected in the ongoing drought, which does relate to if you're cultivating them. And there was a paper that came out a few years ago by there were some University of Arizona researchers involved and some other researchers, and it was a big paper, and they were basically proposing that with climate change that a lot of subtropical plants are going to expand their range to the north, and that there's going to be a lot of plants that are expanding their range because winters are going to become warmer. And so based on that premise, they went into all these different things and look at I think 25 examples or maybe more of different life forms, including some plants. And in the Sky Islands, I understand where they're coming from with that, but when looking at these drivers and looking at these plants, I believe that it's more likely that the Sky Island subtropical plants from a biogeographical point of view are either going to persist or retract. I find it not that plausible to think that these plants are going to expand in range, because again, they're in these isolated sky islands, and these broad lowland, low elevation areas provide significant barriers. And one thing is the precipitation. While we're going to get warmer winters, our precipitation is changing. And sure, with these subtropical plants, we looked at monsoon precipitation, but there's a strong trend over time of our winter precipitation is significantly dropping. And our rainfall is getting really inconsistent. And with these extreme droughts, like one of the subtropical plants many of us saw in the mountains had a terrible year 2 years ago. After that intense 15-month drought that culminated, I think, at the end of 2020, or the summer of 2020, then when we got a great rain. But I think that was the year. And that was Bouvardia glaberrima. That plant just took a horrible hit, and I think it took about 1.5 years. Plants, even this year, some starting to look a little better, but there was some die off, plants died way back. And that was a plant I looked at just from one extreme hotter drought event. It just knocked out populations on a massive level. Another one that didn't do great during that drought was an Araucad. Since that was brought up, you gotta love the Araucads, was Arbutus arizonica, the madrone, Arizona madrone. And that was another plant that didn't do great. And not that this is subtropical, but we also, manzanitas didn't do great, but that Araucad being a fungal associate. So sorry, this is getting way off of your question.
No,
But yeah, so there's a lot of, that's what some of these results go into, what plants will do better. And so some of these plants could serve as valuable indicators of how the overall climate is going to handle, because these are plants at the edge of their range, so they're a lot more sensitive. Another aspect of conservation, possible conservation significance, is plants at the far extent of their distribution experience the harshest conditions, way more than at the center of their range. So that creates some evolutionary potential for genetic variation, adaptation, and so some unique various forms of the plants that could be really valuable to grow. Those ones that can handle those could be really valuable for restoration, finding the ones at this part of our range, because for a while it was always thought in biogeography that plants at the edge of their range were really weak. Now there's a little more thought that some of these populations are going to be really good ones, because they're going to be ones already experiencing really tough conditions. And when we grow plants, when people are growing saguaros, they'll often want to pick in the desert. A lot of people will want to collect seeds from the highest elevation saguaro to get the more cold adapted ones. Or in Silver City, they would look for the highest elevation ocotillos, for the most cold adapted ones. And we've grown, but then again, you think if you're growing in a cultivation, like at the nursery, we've grown hops that somebody collected up in Summer Haven and Mount Lemon at like 7,500 feet, brought them down. We grown at the nursery for like 6 years, produced seeds. Are those plants still as cold adapted? I would tend to think those plants are now more heat adapted and maybe a little, I don't know, they're probably still very cold hardy, but when you're growing things in cultivation, you can start to change what, as they start to adapt to those conditions a bit more. But no, good question. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think at this point, other than me just getting really excited when I see every plant, because now they're all burned in my brain, and when I see them everywhere, I get really excited about all these plants, the annuals or the perennials.
We'll shout it out at plant sales and at the announcements, because we'll be looking for them too.
Yeah. If you're interested, come talk to me. I love talking about which ones they are. So there were too many on the list to list here, but if we get this published, or when we get it published, they'll have the full list in there. It's a really fun list to look at, all the stuff that we tend to like for those plants. Susie.
The mandevilla, are those for sale anywhere?
We sell a lot of the Mandevilla brachysiphon, which is a performer. I gotta say, the way to grow that is you could probably grow it in the ground. I know they have some at the museum in the ground. You could pull it off, but it's a lot harder. It's really easy to grow it in a large pot in cactus soil, and don't water it much over the winter, and they will fill the whole pot. And that's a plant I kind of hoard at home. There's certain plants I like to hoard, and that's one. Manahot, again, the subtropical plants, Manihot, and that one, I like, there's too many pots in the backyard of that, and I just can't get enough of it because it smells so good. Now, the Mandevilla stands, we have grown that, we occasionally sell it, but they don't perform as well. That's a lot finickier. And that one's only known from like 2 tiny populations in Santa Rita's for US localities. But
Do you have to bring them inside in the winter?
no, and that's what's great about the Mandevillas is even though, again, subtropical plants, these are ones that you can grow in Oracle, Sierra Vista, Portal. They'll do just fine in any of those places because they're mid-elevation plants. So in Tucson, leave it outside, let it go totally dormant. In the wintertime, let it go really dry. So.
We have sorry, I know you've been going for a long time here, but we have another question in the chat. Can Jim or somebody in the crowd speak a bit about Taxodium mucronatum, potentially native populations in AZ or New Mexico historically or present time? That's the Montezuma cypress, Taxodium mucronatum.
Unfortunately, I cannot. Yeah, I don't have any knowledge of that. So sorry, I'm not able to answer that. Does anybody have a comment on Taxodium? Yeah, unfortunately not. Yeah, sorry about that. Did anybody else have a question in the back? All right. Well, thank you for, I appreciate having me here, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
Make an announcement
Yeah,
about
go
our
for
next meeting.
Take down your mask so we can understand you.
Yeah, I will.
You're gonna make an announcement or we'll speak into the mic here.
Oh,
You can just leave the.
okay. Well, thank you for coming tonight. And before you go, help yourself to some refreshments. And I just wanted to tell you about our January meeting. It's going to be January 12th, and our speaker will be Carolyn Campbell. Is that right?
Yep.
Yes. I'm sorry, for some reason, all of a sudden that sounded odd to me. So she's the executive director for the Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection. So she's going to be talking several things. She'll be talking about the ironwood forest and a little bit about the history and how that came to be. Also, the Native Plant Society is one of the founding members of the coalition. And so she'll also be talking about opportunities and issues and things that will be coming up in the coming year as far as conservation. And also will give us an update on the plans for the I-11, the interstate that they want, that is proposed from Nogales to the Gila Bend area, which would go through the middle of Avra Valley. And so the Native Plant Society, both the organization and the individual members have spoken out in opposition to that in the past year. So she'll give us an update on where those plans are and what we can do to be effective in trying to prevent that road from going through. So hope to see you all then. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you all so much.
Oh yeah, and happy holidays.
Yeah.